The first thing he felt was the cold. Not the kind of cold you get used to after 20 years in Montana, a different kind, deeper, as if the earth itself were sucking the warmth from his bones. Dan opened his eyes and saw a blurry spot in front of him. A puddle, frozen vomit, his own. He was lying face down on a wooden threshold, and the stench coming from him was so bad he wanted to crawl away from himself. The hands weren't his. Broad, calloused, with cracks on the knuckles and dirt under the nails that wouldn't wash off in a week. He tried to get up, but his body wouldn't obey. Not because it was broken. It was because it was someone else's. The muscles worked differently. His center of gravity had shifted. His knees creaked as if gravel were crumbling inside them. Dan sat down on the threshold and leaned his back against the doorframe. The yard lay before him. An empty woodpile. A fence with boards knocked out. A scrawny goat tied to a post was chewing on its own rope. Snow stretched to the horizon and beyond. The fir trees stood black and motionless, as if painted. And silence. Such silence exists only where people have nothing to say to one another. He looked at his hands once more. He turned his palms upward. The lines were unfamiliar. The scars were unfamiliar. His fingers were shorter and thicker than the ones he'd been used to for 44 years. Something stirred inside his head. Not thoughts. Memories. Someone else's. They seeped in slowly like water through a crack in the wall. A name. Borg Tabish. 38 years old. The village of Kameni Ruche. 2 wives. Irma, Solveig. 3 children. A boy and 2 girls. A debt to Baron Holt. 40 silver coins. A hunting license. No, he used to have one. Drank it away. Reputation. Drunkard. Scum. Gets violent. Even the dogs give him a wide berth. Dan exhaled, and the steam hung in the air like a white cloud. He looked at the snow in front of the porch. Footprints. Automatically, without thinking. His eyes found them on their own. A wolf. A large one. The front paws a finger's width wider than the hind ones. So it's a male. Heavy. He walked without haste, even stride. Not hungry. Just checking the territory. Passed through at night. The snow in the depressions had thawed slightly from the morning air and refrozen into a crust. About 4 hours ago, 20 steps from the porch, a bold beast, knows there's nothing to fear. Dan ran his hand over his face. His beard, tangled, stiff, smells sour. He thought that in a past life, his last case had been exactly like this, tracking a man by his footprints in the snow. Only that man had killed 3 people at a gas station in Billings and fled into the mountains. Dan had followed him for 7 days, found him, brought him in alive, got in the car. He drove home. A truck, a skid. That was it. He didn't even have time to think about Katie, his daughter. She hadn't answered the phone in 8 years. He stopped calling after the 5th year. Not because he'd fallen out of love. It was because every ring into the void took away something he couldn't afford to lose at work. A marshal who lets pain distract him doesn't make it to retirement. He made it. Retirement was set to begin in a week. It won't happen. A door creaked behind him. He turned around. A woman stood in the doorway, short, broad-shouldered. Her face looked as if it had been carved from dry wood. Her eyes were gray and flat, expressionless. Her hands were red from the water. Her apron was stained with something dark. Irma. Someone else's memory suggested the name. His first wife. She looked at him the way one looks at an object that should have been thrown away long ago. But one just can't bring oneself to do it. She said he'd thrown up on the threshold again, and that the children had stepped over it that morning. Dan didn't answer. He looked at her and saw what an ordinary person wouldn't see. A shoulder. The left one. She held it slightly higher than her right. A habit. Not hereditary, acquired. She'd carried heavy loads on that side. For years. Buckets, firewood, children. The fingers on her right hand were curled inward. A habit of gripping a handle, a frying pan, or an axe. Under her eyes, dark circles that wouldn't fade from sleep. Chronic. At least 3 years. This woman hadn't slept properly in 3 years. She waited for him to say something. He said nothing. He stood up. His legs were unsteady. He walked past her into the house. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dampness and rancid grease. The stove was barely smoldering. There was no firewood. A second woman was sitting on a bench by the wall, young, slender, her hair tied back in a bun, hands on her knees. She was staring at the wall, Solveig, the younger wife. She didn't turn her head when he entered, as if he didn't exist. Dan walked over to the stove. He opened the damper. The coals were still hot. He needed firewood. He went back out into the yard. The woodpile was empty. An axe was stuck in a log. The blade was rusty, dull. He picked up the axe and walked to the spruce grove behind the yard. He found a dry spruce tree, a fallen one, thick enough to grip comfortably. He couldn't chop it well. His body wouldn't obey him. The axe kept veering off course. On the third swing, he nearly hit his own knee. He stopped, exhaled, looked at the axe. He looked at the tree. And he started chopping differently. Not like Borg, like Dan. Short strokes, precise, no wind-up. That's how he'd chopped wood for 20 years on his plot in the foothills. His body resisted for the first 10 strokes. Then it got used to it. Half an hour later, an armful of logs lay by the porch. An hour later, the stove was humming. The house grew warmer. No one said thank you. Dan sat down on the porch and looked again at the hare's tracks leading toward the spruce grove. Small, frequent. The hare was walking to feed. It wasn't running. So it wasn't scared. So it comes here all the time. A trail. Dan stood up and followed the tracks. After 200 steps, he found what he was looking for. The spot where the hare crawls under a fallen birch tree. Narrow. The only passage. The snow was trampled down. It comes here every day. Dan took off his shoelace, that very one, from his pants. He tied a loop. Not a simple one, a sliding one, with a stopper made from a bent twig. He tied it to the birch tree at a height of a palm's width above the snow. He straightened it out, stepped back, wiped away his tracks with a fir branch, went back inside. Irma was standing by the stove, stirring something liquid and pale in the pot. Soup. No meat, no fat, water with grains and an onion. She turned toward him, scooped out a bowl. She set it on the table in front of him. She told him to eat, that this was the last of it. Her voice was even, without anger, worse than anger, with weariness. Dan looked at the bowl, looked at her, took a spoon, ate, didn't say a word. 2 hours later, he went out to check the snare. A hare was hanging in it. White. Fat for winter. Still twitching. Dan took it down. Killed it quickly. In one motion. Carried it to the house. Set it on the porch steps. Sat down next to it. Pulled a knife from behind Borg's belt. A dull one. But it would be enough for a hare's pelt. He began to gut it. The door opened. Irma came out. She saw the hare. She looked at him. He waited. She stepped forward and struck him in the chest with the carcass. The hare plopped onto his lap. She said he thought he could buy his way out with a single hare. That for 3 years he'd everything he'd brought home for 3 years and now thinks one carcass will change anything. Dan picked up the hare from his lap. He set it back on the steps and continued butchering it, in silence. She stood over him, waiting for an answer. He didn't answer. He skinned it. He removed the entrails, the liver, the heart, kidneys. He set them aside. He cut the meat into pieces. He laid them on a clean cloth. He lifted his head and looked her in the eyes. For the first time that day. He said there would be 2 hares tomorrow. He stood up and carried the meat into the house. Irma stayed on the porch. She watched his back. There was nothing new on her face. Only the wrinkle between her eyebrows had grown a little deeper. The next morning, Dan woke up in the entryway. He'd slept there of his own free will. Someone else's memory reminded him that Borg had been coming home drunk to his wives for the past year, and that Irma kept an axe under her pillow, not just for decoration. Dan lay down on the bench in the entryway and covered himself with a sheepskin that smelled of dog. He slept soundly. His body was exhausted from the previous day, as if from a forced march. Borg's muscles weren't used to working. They were used to drinking and lying around. Dan got up before dawn. It was dark and quiet outside. The frost was so biting that the air stung his nostrils. He went out through the gate and headed toward the spruce grove. He'd set 2 snares last night while everyone was asleep. The first one was empty. The second held a hare, a big one. He took his catch and continued deeper into the woods, not after hares but after tracks. It felt more natural than breathing. For 22 years, he'd been reading the snow like an open book. Here, the snow spoke louder. The forest was teeming with life. In the first 2 hours, he found a fox's trail, a badger's den beneath the roots of an old cedar, a wild boar's resting spot on the southern slope, a moose's droppings, fresh, from last night, large nuts. So the animal is healthy, an adult. Dan followed the deer's trail without rushing. He was reading it. The left front hoof was placed slightly wider than the right. Not a limp, a habit, an old animal. It follows the same route. Dan followed the trail for an hour and a half and found the spot where the deer had been feeding. A berry patch, lingonberries under the snow. The animal had dug them up with its hooves. The ground was exposed over an area about 2 steps wide. It eats for a long time. It isn't scared. That means it's quiet here. There are no predators, or very few. Dan memorized the spot. He looked at the trail. The deer was heading east toward the stream. There's water there, so the route is simple. Resting spot, berry patch, watering hole, and back. Every day. Dan didn't pursue it. He returned home. He butchered the hare in the yard. He set aside the liver and heart. He cut the meat into pieces. He went inside. Solveig was sitting in the same spot as yesterday. It was as if she hadn't moved. The children were playing on the floorboards. 2 of them. A boy of about 7, a girl of about 5. The third was very small. Solveig was holding her in her arms. Dan put the meat on the table. Solveig didn't look up. He retrieved her story from someone else's memory. 16 years old. Her parents had given her away to Borg, not out of love, out of poverty. 1 less mouth to feed. She spoke for 2 more years, then she stopped. A year and a half ago, she spoke her last word in this house. Dan didn't know what it was. Borg didn't remember. He put the meat on to cook, by himself. Irma walked in and saw him at the stove. She stopped. Something like surprise flashed across her face. She said he'd forgotten how to hold a ladle or something. Dan replied that he hadn't forgotten. Irma sat down at the table. She watched him cook. He added an onion to the pot, the last 2 potatoes from the cellar, a pinch of salt. When the meat was tender, he ladled it into bowls. 4 bowls, for Irma, for Solveig, for the kids. He didn't serve himself. He sat down on the bench by the wall and began to think. Irma ate in silence. Solveig ate in silence. The kids ate quickly and quietly, like little animals, used to grabbing whatever they could before it was taken away. Dan watched them and thought of Katie. The last time he'd seen his daughter, she was 12. She'd been standing on the porch of her mother's house and hadn't waved goodbye to him. He'd thought then that he'd be back in 2 weeks to talk to her. He didn't come back. 2 weeks later, there was a call. Then another. Then yet another. 20 years had passed like one long call. And now here he was, sitting in a stranger's house, looking at strangers' children who were afraid of him. The boy looked up from his bowl and quickly looked away. Dan recognized that look. He'd seen it hundreds of times. That's how children look when their father raises his hand. They're testing him, to see if he's calm or not, sober or not. Should he stay, or would it be better to leave? Dan turned away toward the wall. He clenched his jaw, not out of anger, but because of something else. Something the marshals don't show. After breakfast, he went out into the yard and got to work. The axe needed sharpening. He found a stone by the stream behind the house, flat, grainy. It would do. He sat down on a log and began sharpening, monotonously, with even strokes. An hour later, the blade was shaving off shavings as thin as a fingernail. Then he took up the knife. That very one. The Borgovsky. Rusty. He filed off the rust, straightened the edge. The knife became something else. Not a good one, but it worked. Then he went to repair the fence. 2 boards were knocked out. I found some scraps in the shed. No nails. I carved out some wooden pegs. I hammered them in. The fence stood straight. Then the goat. The rope had frayed. He replaced it with a strip of leather from an old belt he'd found hanging on a nail in the entryway. The goat looked at him with an expression he'd seen on his ex-wife's face when she found out about the vacation he'd canceled yet again. By evening, the yard looked different. Not good, but different. Someone had been working here. It was obvious. Irma came out before sunset. She scanned the yard, the repaired fence, the sharpened axe on the log, the woodpile which had grown by a third. She turned to him. He was waiting for her to speak. She said that 1 week meant nothing, that she'd seen him get his act together before. 3 days, then a bottle, and the whole thing all over again. Dan nodded. He didn't argue. She was right. Borg did exactly that. 3 days of sobriety, then a relapse. Irma knew that cycle by heart. There was only one way to prove he wasn't Borg. Time. He went out onto the porch, lay down on the bench, covered himself with a sheepskin, closed his eyes. Before falling asleep, he thought about that deer. Tomorrow he would go out and find a place to set the snare. Not a small one like a hare's. A big one. A serious one. At dawn on the third day, he left before anyone in the house woke up. He took the rope with him, the only one in the shed. A short one, rotten at the end. He cut off the rotten part and measured what was left. 4 steps. Not much, but enough for a noose with an anchor. He walked toward the berry patch. Along the way, he cut down a young birch tree, supple, damp. He bent it into an arch. It held. Good. It has spring. By the berry patch, he found fresh tracks. A deer had come by during the night, right on schedule. Dan set the snare on the trail between the berry patch and the stream. A simple one, a slip knot on a rope. The birch spring was tied to the anchor tree. A stick served as a trigger. The deer steps on it. The stick pops out. The birch straightens. The snare tightens around its leg. The animal hangs there. Dan checked the snare 3 times. He camouflaged the snare with snow. He covered his tracks. He left. On the morning of the 4th day, he came to the snare and saw it. A winter moose. Not a deer, a moose. Huge, antlers 4 palms wide. The snare held him by the front leg. The birch tree bent but didn't break. The beast struggled but ran out of breath. He stood there, breathing heavily, and looked at Dan with dark, wet eyes. Dan stepped forward. A knife to the throat. Quick. Clean. The moose fell to the snow and went still a minute later. Dan stood over it, breathing heavily. Not from exhaustion, from realization. This moose weighed more than all the food the Tavish family had seen in the last 3 months. He tied together a drag line from poles and fir branches. He loaded the carcass onto it. He dragged it for 2 hours. His hands went numb. His back ached. He walked into the yard and slipped the rope off his shoulder. The carcass lay on the sled in the middle of the yard like a small mountain. Irma came out of the house. She stopped on the porch. Solveig followed her out. A neighbor's boy craned his neck over the fence. 10 minutes later, 4 people were standing by the fence. Half an hour later, the whole street was there. Dan paid no attention. He was working. He skinned the carcass, in one piece, without any cuts, just as the old Cree hunter in Great Falls 30 years ago. He separated the tenderloin, the liver, the tongue. Here, these were considered scraps, dog food. Dan knew the value of these cuts. He worked silently and precisely. Each cut along a muscle group, each piece in its place. Bones separate, fat separate, tendons separate. By evening, not a single drop of blood remained on the snow in the yard. Everything used, everything laid out. Irma had been standing nearby for the last hour, watching. Not at the meat, at his hands, at the way they moved. Borg didn't know how to do this. Borg didn't know how to do any of this. Dan brought the liver into the house. He found a skillet, a cast iron one, heavy, the only one. He sliced the liver thinly, the onion into rings. In the corner, he found a jar of soaked lingonberries, the last one. He tossed a handful into the skillet. He fried it in the fat he'd cut from the moose. The house filled with a smell that made the children's eyes gleam from their bunks. He set the skillet on the table. 5 bowls. One for himself, too. Today it's okay. Irma sat down. She picked up a spoon. She tasted it. and froze. She held the spoon to her mouth and didn't move. Then she lowered her hand onto the table. A tear ran down her face. Just one. Not out of anger. For the first time in 3 years, not out of anger. She didn't say anything. She kept eating. Solveig ate slowly. For the first time all day, she looked up at Dan. Straight into his eyes. For 2 seconds. Then she looked away. But those 2 seconds were the first time in a year and a half that she had even looked at her husband. By evening, the village elder arrived. A heavy-set man with a red face and shifty eyes. He said he'd heard about the moose and asked if Borg would sell the hind legs. He'd offer a good price, in copper. Dan looked at him. He asked what the price was. The village head named his price. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said he'd sell them. But not to the village head. To town. Directly. And not for copper. The village head laughed. He asked how Dan was going to haul them to town. On his own back, perhaps? After all, he had neither a wagon nor a horse. Dan replied that that was no longer the village headman's concern. The village headman left. His face was no longer cheerful. On the 5th day, Dan went to the village. Stone Creek turned out to be just as he'd expected. 23 homesteads along the frozen creek, log houses, low sloping roofs. The smoke from every chimney was thin and pale. Everyone was short on firewood. People looked at him and turned away. A distant memory reminded him. Borg was the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid, not because they were afraid, but because he was repulsive. Dan was walking toward the general store, the only one in the village. It was run by a buyer named Graham. He was fat, with a red beard and hands like shovels. He bought everything from the village: fur, meat, hides, herbs. He paid in copper, a third of the city price. Everyone knew it. No one argued. Because it was a 3-day walk to the city along the winter road, and none of the peasants had the right to trade without the buyer's permit. Graham sat behind the counter, picking his teeth with a splinter. He saw Dan and grinned. He said he'd heard about the moose, and that it was quite a miracle, and that Borg must have finally sobered up. Dan placed a bundle on the counter. He unwrapped it. A moose hide, intact, not a single cut. Graham stopped picking his teeth. He leaned over and felt the hide. His fingers ran over the hide. He looked at Dan with new eyes. A hide like this was tanned by master craftsmen in the city workshops, not by village drunks. Graham named his price. 15 copper coins. Dan stood there in silence. Graham added 2 copper coins. Dan remained silent. Graham frowned and said it was a good price, and that even in town they wouldn't pay more for something like this. Dan knew he was lying. A winter moose hide cost at least 3 silver coins in town. 17 copper coins is less than 1 silver coin. Dan took the hide. He rolled it back up. Graham asked where he was headed. Dan replied that he was going to town. Graham said that without a dealer's license, he couldn't trade at the town market, and that it was the law. Dan asked whose law. Graham said the Baron's. Dan nodded. He walked out. He knew this trick. In Montana, every county had its own little kings who decided who could and couldn't do what. Only there, they were called county officials. Here, they were barons. The bottom line was the same, a monopoly on a piece of paper. Dan went back home. He sat on the porch. He thought. He needed a horse or a wagon to get to town. He had neither. He had moose meat that needed to be preserved. The frost was doing the work for him. The meat hung in the shed and wasn't spoiling, but it wouldn't hang there forever. Dan went to visit his neighbors. The third house from his yard, an old man named Olaf, a former hunter, one leg. He'd lost the other in the woods, a bear. Olaf had a wagon, a summer wagon, without runners, useless in winter. But under Olaf's shed stood an old sled. Dan looked at it. The runner was cracked, but the wood was good, sturdy. He asked Olaf if he'd lend him the sled. Olaf looked at him for a long time. He asked why. Dan said he wanted to take the meat to town. Olaf snorted. He said it was 3 days to town and, without a horse, there was no one to pull the sled. Dan said he'd pull it himself. Olaf was silent. Then he said the runner was cracked. Dan said he'd fix it. Olaf was silent again. Then he said that if Borg fixed the sled and brought it back in one piece, then he could take it. But if he broke it, he'd owe him 5 copper coins. Dan agreed. He took the sled and dragged it home through the snow. He fixed the runner that evening. He found a birch branch in the forest with just the right curve. He whittled it down. He tied it to the cracked spot with wet strips of hide. The hide would dry and tighten it securely. On the morning of the 6th day, he loaded the sled. Moose meat, the hind legs, the ribs, Part of the loin. The hide. Separately, a bundle of hareskins. 4 of them. Over the past 5 days, he'd caught 3 more hares in snares. Irma stepped out onto the porch. She asked where he was going. Dan said, to town. She asked how long he'd be gone. He said 3 days there and 3 back. She stood there watching. Then she said that if he drank it all away in town, he might as well not come back. Her voice was even. She wasn't threatening him. She was stating a fact. Dan nodded. He hitched himself to the sled and set off. The trip to town took not 3 days, but 2.5. Dan traveled quickly. He slept little. He could build a fire in 4 minutes. He ate the dried meat he'd sliced before leaving. During his stops, he checked his cargo. The meat was holding up. The frost wouldn't let up. The town was called Steinholm. A fortress wall, wooden, tall, with a gate guarded by a sentry. Dan approached the gate, and the guard asked who he was and what he wanted. Dan said he was Borg Tavish from Stone Creek. He'd brought goods to sell. The guard asked if he had a letter of authorization from a buyer. Dan said no. The guard said he couldn't enter the market without a letter. Dan asked if he could sell his goods privately instead of at the market. The guard scratched behind his ear and said that, while it didn't seem to be forbidden, he wasn't sure. Dan thanked him and entered the city. He didn't go to the market. He headed for the taverns. At the first tavern, the owner looked at the meat and offered 20 copper coins for the whole lot. Dan left. At the second tavern, the landlady turned out to be smarter. She tasted the tenderloin. She looked at the hide. She asked who had butchered it. Dan said he had done it himself. She raised an eyebrow. She offered 2 silver coins for the meat and 3 for the hide. Dan paused. He said he'd take 2 silver coins for the meat, 4 for the pelt. The landlady laughed and said he didn't look like a country bumpkin. They settled on 3.5 for the pelt. Dan received 5.5 silver coins. He sold the hare pelts to the furrier around the corner. Another silver coin. 6.5 silver coins. In the village of Graham, he would have gotten less than 1 for all of this. Dan bought salt at the market. A sack. 3 pounds of iron nails. A coil of good rope. 20 cubits. Arrowheads. 10 of them. And onions. 2 sacks. He spent 2 silver coins. 4.5 left. 40 in debt to the baron. 4.5 earned in a week. The math is simple. He needs 10 trips like this to pay off the debt. Or 1 good idea. Before leaving town, he stopped by one place. A general store on a side street. There he bought a comb. A wooden, with fine teeth. Well polished. It cost 4 copper coins. Nonsense. But he spent 10 minutes choosing it. The return trip took 2 days. He traveled light. The sled was almost empty. Just provisions. He entered the courtyard toward evening on the 8th day. Irma was standing by the well. She saw him. She looked at the sled. No meat. No hides. She had been waiting. Dan walked over. He pulled his wallet from behind his belt. He poured the silver into his palm. 4.5 silver coins. Irma looked at the money. Then at him. Then back at the money. She didn't say a word. He unloaded the sacks from the sled. Salt, nails, rope, onions. He set them against the wall of the shed. Then he took a comb out of his pocket. Silently, he held it out to her. Irma took it. She turned it over in her hands. She looked at him. He could see the muscles in her face twitching, how she wanted to say something but didn't. She put the comb in her apron pocket and went into the house. Dan stood in the yard and watched as the red winter sun set behind the spruce grove. He felt that sensation he remembered from a past life. When you bring a fugitive in alive, hand him over to the sheriff, get into the car, and just sit there for a minute with your eyes closed. Not joy, not pride, just a quiet realization that today you did what you had to do. On the 9th day, Dan began to build. Not a house, a system. In the morning, he went out into the woods and walked a 3-hour route. In a circle. From the house to the spruce grove. Through the birch grove to the stream. Along the stream to the wild boar's lair. Back through the windfall past the fox's den. He wasn't hunting. He was counting. Counting trails. Counting burrows. Counting feeding spots. A map was taking shape in his mind that no hunter in Kameni Ruchie possessed. Because the locals hunted differently. They went into the woods and looked for game. Dan wasn't looking for game. He knew where the game would be. The difference between these two approaches was worth tens of silver coins a month. By noon he was back and sat on the porch with his walking stick. He drew a diagram in the trampled snow. 7 dots. 7 spots for snares for the shadow sable. Shadow sable. Borg's borrowed memory knew that word. A small animal. Its fur was black with a violet sheen. In town, a pelt cost between 2 and 5 silver coins. In the capital, twice that. Here they caught it with crude snap traps that ruined the pelt. Or they shot it with a bow, which ruined the fur even more. Dan planned to catch it differently. He spent 2 days building traps. Not snap traps, live traps, made of twigs and rope. The principle was simple. A cage of interwoven twigs, a door on the trap house. Bait inside. The animal walks in. The guardrail drops. The door closes. The animal is alive. The pelt is intact. Trappers in Montana had been doing this for 200 years. No one here had thought of it. Irma watched what he was doing. On the second day, she asked what kind of traps they were. Dan explained. Briefly. She listened. Her expression was inscrutable. Then she asked why he would catch them alive when he could just kill them. Dan replied that a dead sable lies in the trap for hours. The fur gets crumpled. Blood soaks into it. A live animal sits in the cage, clean and intact. You catch it. You kill it. You skin it right away. The fur is perfect. Irma was silent for a moment. Then she said that wasn't a bad idea. Coming from her, it sounded like an order. On the 11th day, he set 7 traps according to his map. Each at a spot where he'd found sable tracks, droppings, scratches on the bark, gnawed pine cones, remnants of mouse nests. He made the bait from hare guts and fish he'd caught in the ice-free stretch of the stream. He checked the snares every other day. The first week, 3 sables. All alive. All with pristine fur. Dan skinned them using the method he'd learned from the old trapper Bill Kessler back in '86 in Bitterroot. Make an incision at the tail. Pull the skin off like a sock. Not a single cut on the fur. You stretch the pelts over a wicker frame. Dry them in the shade, not in the sun, not by the fire, in the shade. The fur retains its luster and softness. Second week, 4 more sables, 1 fox. He hadn't planned on the fox, but it had walked into a large wild boar trap baited with boar meat. 7 sable pelts lay on a shelf in the shed. Smooth. Black with a sheen. Not a single blemish. Irma walked into the shed and saw them. She stood there, running her fingers through the fur. Dan watched as her fingers stroked the pelts. Slowly. She had never worn sable. She had never held anything more valuable than a hair pelt in her hands. She asked how much they were worth. Dan said each was worth 2 silver coins in town. She did the math in her head. 14 silver coins. In 2 weeks, she owed the Baron 40. 3 months of such collections. She looked at Dan. And for the first time, there was no suspicion on her face. No expectation of a catch. Something else. Something like the beginning of faith. Dan didn't wait. On the 13th day, he hitched himself to the sled again. 7 pelts. A fox pelt. The remains of moose meat he'd smoked over a fire. This time he went into town with a plan. Not to the tavern, to the shopping street, to the furriers. The first furrier looked at the pelts and offered 2 silver coins per pelt. Dan moved on. The second furrier turned the pelt over in his hands. He stretched it out. He looked at the flesh side. He looked at Dan. He asked who had tanned them. Dan said he had done it himself. The furrier said he'd never seen a flesh side like that from a villager. Not a single cut. Not a single stain. Perfectly skinned. He offered 3 silver coins each. Dan paused. Then he laid all 7 out in a row. He said he wanted 4 per piece for the whole lot. The furrier laughed and said that was a capital city price. Dan replied that it was capital city quality. They settled on 3.5. 24.5 silver coins, plus 1 silver coin for the fox, plus 1.5 for the meat, 27 silver coins, for a single trip. Dan stood on Steinholm's Market Street with a purse containing more money than Borg Tavish had seen in the last 5 years. He bought what he needed. Good quality, 5 skeins. Iron wire, 2 skeins. Arrowheads, 20 of them. A cauldron, a new one. Cast iron. Ermine's had a crack in it. A knife. A real one. Steel, with a wooden handle. 2 pieces of good cloth. A sack of flour. A sack of groats. Salt. Candles. He could have bought more, but he had a marshal's habit. Not to spend more than necessary. A surplus is a cushion. A cushion is security. He saved 13 silver coins. 40 minus 13. 27 left to pay off the debt. The return trip, 2 days. He entered the courtyard with a fully loaded sleigh. The children were the first to see him. A boy ran up to the sleigh and stopped 3 steps away. He didn't dare come any closer. Dan set the sack of flour down on the snow. He looked at the boy. The boy's name was Torin, 7 years old, skinny, quiet. His eyes were wary. Dan didn't smile. He didn't beckon him. He just set the sack down and walked away. Torin approached the sack. He touched it. He looked at Dan. Dan nodded. The boy wrapped both arms around the sack and dragged it toward the house. The sack was bigger than he was, but he dragged it. Dan watched him and thought about that boy from Helena, the son of the fugitive he'd apprehended in '98. The boy was 6. He'd stood on the porch watching as his father was led away in handcuffs. The same look. Mature. Wary. Too early. Irma took the new kettle out of the sled and set it on the table. The old one, with the crack, stood next to it. She looked at both of them, then at Dan. He was waiting. She said the old one would still work, that the crack could be patched with clay. Dan said it could, that 2 pots were better than 1. She nodded. She put both away. That evening, Irma cooked porridge in the new pot. Thick. With meat. With onions. The children ate in silence. Not because they were afraid, because their mouths were full. Solveig ate too. She still didn't speak. But Dan noticed that she had tucked her hair behind her ear. A small thing. But a woman who has stopped taking care of herself doesn't tuck her hair back. So something had shifted. After dinner, Dan took his latest purchase out of the sled. A bundle of dried herbs. He'd bought it from a herbalist at the market. Not expensive. 5 copper coins. Mint. St. John's wort. Chamomile. Thyme. Yarrow. He placed the bundle on the table in front of Solveig. She looked up. He asked what she knew how to brew from them. Silence. Irma paused with the ladle in her hand. The children fell quiet. Solveig looked at the herbs, then at Dan, then back at the herbs. She reached out and took a sprig of mint, brought it to her face, sniffed it. Then she took the chamomile, then the thyme. She went through the herbs one by one. Slowly, her fingers moved with confidence. She knew what she was doing. She raised her head and spoke her first word in a year and a half. She said that the chamomile was old and needed to steep longer. Her voice was quiet, hoarse from disuse, but it was a voice. Irma turned away toward the stove. Her shoulders trembled. She didn't cry. She just stood there, holding the ladle with both hands. Dan nodded to Solveig. He said he'd bring her fresh willow bark and dandelion roots from under the snow tomorrow if she showed him where they grew. Solveig nodded. Once, briefly. That was more than he'd expected. By the end of the 3rd week, the Tavish house had changed. Not on the outside. From the outside, it was still the same crooked log cabin. But on the inside, the stove burned steadily. Firewood lay in the woodpile, enough to last a week. Food stood on the table. Not just a thin soup made of water and onions. Porridge with meat. Fish from the stream. Hare liver with lingonberries. The children stopped grabbing their bowls and running off to the loft. They began to eat at the table. Thorin sat up straight and held his spoon like a grown-up. 2 girls. The older one was Liv, 5 years old. The younger one was Astrid, a year and a half old. Astrid sat on Solveig's lap and reached for the bowl with her hands. Solveig fed her from a spoon, silently, but without that glassy stare at the wall anymore. Dan watched. He didn't interfere. He didn't try to play the role of a father. He didn't try to hug the children or joke with them. He did what he knew how to do. He worked. The children saw it. Every day, their father would leave for the forest before dawn and return with game. Every evening, he would sharpen his knives and fix something around the house. He didn't yell, he didn't drink, he didn't raise a hand. For them, it was like the changing of the seasons, as if winter had suddenly decided to be less harsh. They didn't trust him, but they stopped being afraid. That was the beginning. On the morning of the 22nd day, Dan set to work on the hides. Not sable hides, a moose hide. It was hanging in the shed, drying. He took it down and spread it out on the snow. The hide was stiff, unyielding. In that condition, it was worth 3 silver coins. Once tanned, it would be worth 12. It's a difference in method. The locals tanned hides with bark. It took a long time, a month. The result was rough. The hide was thick and brittle. Dan knew another way, the Indian way. The same old man from Great Falls had shown it to him. You take the animal's brain, boil it, spread it over the hide, wrap it up, wait through the night, unwrap it, knead it with your hands. For a long time, about 3 hours. Then you smoke it over a campfire. The hide turns out as soft as fabric. It bends. It doesn't break. It doesn't get wet. He started working. Irma came in an hour later. She stood there and watched. He explained what he was doing. Not because she asked, because he saw how she was looking at his hands. She wanted to understand. He told her about the brain and why it needed to be boiled. About how the fat in the brain seeps into the fibers of the hide and makes them supple. She listened. She didn't interrupt. 2 hours later, she said she wanted to try. Dan gave her a piece of hide. A small one, a hare's, for practice. She took it and began to knead it. Her hands were strong. She kneaded the hide like dough, furiously, intently. An hour later, the hide was soft. Irma looked at the result. She looked at her hands. Dan saw an expression on her face that he knew well. That's what a person looks like when they've just discovered they can do something new. Not joy, hunger. She wanted more. The next day, she came to the shed on her own in the morning and asked if there were any more hides. Dan gave her 3 rabbit hides. By evening, all 3 had been tanned, roughly, but soft. Irma became part of the process. Dan hadn't asked her to. She came on her own. Solveig was changing too, more slowly, more quietly. On the 23rd day, she walked out through the gate on her own for the first time. Not with Dan, not because he'd asked her to, but on her own. She went to the stream and returned an hour later with a bunch of green stems she'd pulled from under the snow. Winter horsetail. She brewed it in a pot. Set it aside to cool. That evening, she rubbed the horsetail decoction into Liv's chapped hands. Liv didn't pull her hand away. It was a milestone. On the 25th day, what Dan had been waiting for and dreading happened. A man sent by the Baron arrived at the house. Not the Baron himself, the steward. His name was Cain. Thin, tall, wearing a fine fur coat. Behind him were 2 horsemen, guards. Cain dismounted at the gate and walked into the yard as if he were at his own home. He looked around. He saw a woodpile, traps drying on the wall, hides in the barn, things that hadn't been here before. Dan stepped out onto the porch. Cain looked at him and said that some interesting rumors had reached the Baron. That Borg Tavish had suddenly come to his senses and begun trading in town in violation of Merchant Graham's charter. That this was a breach of the Baron's trade charter. That Baron Holt wanted to remind him that the debt of 40 silver coins was still outstanding, and that if Borg didn't pay it off by the end of winter, the Baron would seize the house and land by law. Dan stood there listening. Inside him, the Marshal was waking up, the very same Marshal who had spent 20 years working with people who considered themselves above the law. He didn't interrupt Cain. He waited until Cain had finished. Then he asked if Cain had seen the Baron's charter with his own eyes. Cain frowned. He said that the charter was common knowledge. Dan asked which article of the charter stated that a peasant could not sell his goods in town without a buyer's certificate. Cain hesitated. Dan continued. He said that, according to the royal edict from the year before last, a free peasant has the right to trade the produce of his own labor in any town in the kingdom, provided he pays the town tax. Cain blinked. Dan saw it. The steward didn't know about the edict. Or perhaps he did, but didn't think a village drunkard would know. Dan knew, because he'd spent half a day in the town hall and read all the decrees posted on the wall. A marshal's habit, to know the laws of the territory where you work. Kane was silent for a moment. Then he said the Baron wouldn't like this. Dan replied that it wasn't his concern, that he would pay the debt, on time, in full, and that if the Baron wanted to talk, he should come himself instead of sending people to intimidate his wife and children. Kane turned and left. The guards followed him. Irma was standing in the doorway. She'd heard everything. Dan turned around. She was looking at him with that look he was beginning to recognize. Distrust. Not yet. But the door that had been locked for 3 years had opened just a crack. He went inside. He sat down on a bench. His hands weren't shaking. But inside, he had that feeling he remembered from interrogations, when you're half bluffing, and know that if they call your bluff, the house of cards will come crashing down. The royal edict existed. That was true. But Dan didn't know if it applied to the northern lands. The barons here had special privileges. Maybe the edict didn't apply here. Maybe Holt knew this better than he did. Dan rubbed his face with his hands. He needed to find out more, much more, about the laws, about the Baron, about how power worked in this world. One hunt wouldn't be enough to pay off the debt if the Baron decided to change the rules. That evening, Solveig set a mug in front of him, a herbal tea, mint and chamomile, hot. She didn't say a word. She set it down and went to the children. Dan picked up the mug, took a sip, bitter and warm. It was quiet on the porch. Snow was falling in large flakes. Somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled. That very same one, the brazen one. Dan thought that in a past life, he'd be sitting in an empty apartment in Helena right now, watching baseball on TV, alone, with a beer, without a call from his daughter, without anyone's herbal tea in a mug. Here he was, sitting on the porch of a stranger's house with a stranger's mug. And for the first time in many years, he felt that someone knew he was back. On the 30th day, Dan realized that the sable traps were no longer catching anything. Not because the animals had run out, because the animals had gotten smarter. The shadow sable learned quickly. For the first 2 weeks, it had walked right into the bait like a blind animal. Now it was skirting around the traps. Dan found the tracks that morning. The little animal had come within 3 steps of the trap. It stopped, turned around, walked away. Near the cage, there were tiny dots of urine in the snow. A mark. The sable had warned the others. Dan crouched down and smirked. In Montana, coyotes did the same thing. After 2 months, any trap becomes just another piece of furniture. You have to change everything: the location, the bait, the design, the scent. He removed all 7 snares and moved them to new spots. He set 3 closer to the stream, 2 at the edge of the spruce and birch groves, 2 in the wind throw near the wild boar trail. He changed the bait. Instead of offal, he placed pieces of smoked fish smeared with fat. A different scent, unfamiliar to the animal. He also carved new trap frames from a different type of wood. He replaced birch with alder, a different color, a different scent of wood, a trifle to a human. Not a trifle to a sable, whose nose is 40 times more sensitive. 3 days later, 2 animals were caught in the traps. The system was working again. But Dan was thinking about something else. The traps brought in silver. The silver paid off the debt. But the debt to the Baron is just a symptom. The real problem lies elsewhere. The problem is that the entire village lives on its knees. Graham buys up what's worth silver for the price of copper. The Baron holds the charter like a leash. The peasants don't know that their goods are worth 6 times as much. Dan can earn money on his own. But alone, he can't change the rules. For that, he needs people. On the 32nd day, he went to see Olaf. The old man was sitting by the stove, whittling a spoon. A wooden leg stood by the bench, leaning against the wall. Dan sat down across from him. He was silent for a moment. Then he asked how much Olaf got from Graham for a winter hare. Olaf said 2 copper coins per carcass. Dan asked if Olaf knew how much a hare was worth in town. Olaf shrugged and said how would he know, since he hadn't been to town in 4 years. His leg wouldn't let him. Dan said that a hare carcass in town was worth 8 copper coins. The pelt was worth another 5. Olaf stopped whittling. He looked at Dan. Dan continued. He said that if Olaf set snares according to the map Dan had just shown him, and if the catch went through Dan to the city, Olaf would get 5 copper coins per carcass and 3 for the pelt. Olaf was silent for a long time. Then he asked what Dan would get. Dan replied that he'd get the rest, and that it was fairer than what Graham paid. Olaf thought about it some more. Then he said he could set snares even on 1 leg, if there was a place to do it. Dan showed him 3 spots and explained how to set them. No pressure traps, just sliding snares on the watchtower. Olaf listened carefully. The old man's hands were crooked from arthritis, but his fingers still worked. The next day, Dan went to see another neighbor, Bjorn. Young, 26, strong as an ox, but dumb as a stump. That's what the village said. Dan saw him differently. Bjorn wasn't dumb. Bjorn was slow. He took a long time to think, but he thought correctly, and he had golden hands. He could bend an iron rod with his bare fingers. Dan offered him a job. Not hunting, making traps. Dan would show him how. Bjorn would make them. 10 a week, payment in kind, meat and fur. Bjorn agreed right away. He had nothing to eat. By the 35th day, Dan had 12 new traps. Bjorn made them roughly but sturdily. Dan adjusted the trigger mechanisms indoors. He set them out throughout the forest. Now 19 traps were working at the same time. The catch increased. Sable, hare, martens, foxes, ermines. Every 3 days, Dan walked the line and collected the catch. He skinned the animals himself. He taught Irma. She learned eagerly, silently, without questions. She watched once and then repeated the process. By the end of the second week, she was skinning animals just as well as he was. Even faster. Her hands had grown accustomed to the knife. On the 37th day, Dan made his third trip to town. The sled was full. 14 sable pelts, 6 hare pelts, 2 marten pelts, 1 ermine. Smoked meat, a bundle of dried fish. He went to the same furrier. The man saw him and stood up from the table. He looked at the goods. He shook his head. He said the quality was improving and that he hadn't expected this from a village hunter. They struck a deal quickly. The furrier already knew it was pointless to haggle with this man. Dan knew his worth and wouldn't go below a fair price. 38 silver coins. For a single trip. Dan left the furrier's shop and stopped on the street. 38, plus the 13 he'd saved. 51. He owed the Baron 40. He could have paid it off right then and there. But he didn't. Not because he was greedy, because the marshal in him was speaking. Don't pay the debt until you know the rules of the game. The Baron will get his money and find a new excuse. A new debt. A new fine. That's how the system works. Money doesn't solve the problem. Money only solves the problem when you know how to pay it back so they can't demand more from you. Dan went to the magistrate's office, a building with a stone porch. It was warm inside. A clerk sat at a desk. Dan asked to see the collection of the Baron's statutes for the northern lands. The clerk raised his eyebrows. He asked why a peasant would need the statutes. Dan replied that he wanted to know his obligations to the Baron so he could fulfill them properly. The clerk shrugged and brought a dusty book. Dan sat down in a corner and began to read. The language was archaic, cumbersome, but readable. Borg's foreign memory gave him literacy in the local language. Not brilliant, but sufficient. He read for 3 hours. He found what he was looking for. Article 17. A peasant who owes a debt to his suzerain is obligated to pay it by the deadline set by the suzerain. In the event of non-payment, the suzerain has the right to seize the debtor's property. However, Article 23. If the debtor repays the debt in full and in a single payment in the presence of a magistrate's witness, the suzerain is obligated to issue a certificate of debt discharge and has no right to make additional claims on the same grounds. Dan reread it twice. A magistrate's witness. That's the key. Not just handing the money over to the Baron, handing it over in a witness from the magistrate's court who will record the payment. Then the Baron won't be able to say he didn't receive the money. He won't be able to invent a new debt based on the old one. Paper, seal, witness. 3 things that make a peasant invulnerable to the Baron. Dan closed the book and handed it back to the clerk. He thanked him. The clerk nodded absently. He didn't even look at Dan. Just another dirty peasant from the village. Dan stepped out onto the street and breathed in the frosty air. Now he knew how to pay off the debt. All that remained was to do it before the Baron had a chance to react. He bought a few more things at the market. 2 pots with lids, clay ones, for ointments. For Solveig. The return trip took 2 days. He walked and thought about the Baron, about Cain, about Graham. 3 links in the same chain. The Baron at the top, the manager in the middle, the middleman at the bottom. All 3 make their money off the fact that peasants don't know their rights and can't count. Dan could count, and now he knew his rights. In his past life, he'd put 11 people behind bars who thought the law was whatever they decided it to be. Baron Holt was the 12th. Only here there are no handcuffs. Here there's a document with a seal, but the essence is the same. On the 42nd day, Dan paid off his debt. He carried it out like an operation, with preparation, with a precise timeline, with a backup plan. In the morning, he loaded up the sleigh and headed into town. Not alone, with Irma. She didn't want to go. She said she had nothing to do in town. Dan replied that she did have something to do, to be a witness. She looked at him for a long time, silently. Then she threw on her sheepskin coat and followed the sled. The journey took 2 days. Irma walked in silence. She didn't complain. She didn't fall behind. Dan noticed that she walked steadily and with strength. 20 versts a day through the snow was no feat for her. She'd been walking like that for 3 years, carrying buckets, firewood, and sacks. It was just that before, she'd been walking around the yard. Now she was walking along the road. In Steinholm, the first thing Dan did was go to the furrier. He sold the hides. He received money, 44 silver coins. Together with what he had set aside, that made 68. Then he went to the magistrate's office. He asked for a magistrate's witness to help him pay off his debt to his suzerain. The clerk looked at him in surprise. He said that peasants usually paid their debts directly. Dan said he wanted to do it according to the law, Article 23. The clerk frowned. He looked it up in the book. He read it. He looked at Dan. He nodded. He said the witness would cost 2 silver coins. Dan paid. The witness turned out to be a young man in a clean doublet. His name was Torvin. He was the junior magistrate's clerk. Dan explained to him what was needed. To go to Baron Holt's office. To witness the payment. To affix a seal. Torvin nodded. Baron Holt's office in Steinholm stood on the main street. A stone building, 2 stories high, with a coat of arms above the door. A stag with a crown in its teeth. Dan went in first. Irma followed him. Torvin followed her. Manager Kane was sitting at a desk, writing something. He saw Dan and looked up. His expression hardened. Then he saw Irma. Then Torvin. Then the magistrate's badge on Torvin's doublet. His expression changed. Cautious. Dan walked up to the desk and set down the purse. 40 silver pieces. He said he had come to pay off Tavish Borg's debt to Baron Holt, in full and in a single payment, in the presence of a magistrate's witness, pursuant to Article 23 of the Baron's statute. Kane looked at the purse, then at Torvin, then at Dan. He didn't move. Dan could see what was going on in his head. Kane understood that if he accepted the money in front of a witness, the noose of debt would be cut forever. Borg would be free. No fines, no additional fees. A clean slate. Kane said that the Baron was currently out of town and that he was not authorized to accept payments of this kind. Dan had expected this. He turned to Torvin and asked what the law said if a suzerain's representative refused to accept payment in the presence of a witness. Torvin cleared his throat. He looked at his papers. He said that according to Article 24, if a suzerain's representative refuses to accept a payment in the presence of a magistrate's witness, the debt is considered settled, and the witness records the refusal. Kane turned pale. Dan looked at him and waited. He'd seen this moment dozens of times in interrogations, when a man realizes that both paths lead away from where he wants to go. Accepting the money means losing leverage. Refusing means losing the money. Kane reached out and took the purse. He counted it, 40 silver pieces. He looked at Torvin. Torvin wrote out the document. Date, amount, the debtor's name, the name of the suzerain's representative, the magistrate's seal. 2 copies, one for Kane, one for Dan. Dan took his copy, folded it, tucked it into his belt, turned and walked out. Irma followed him. Out on the street, she stopped. Dan turned around. She was standing there, looking at him. Snow was falling on her shoulders and head, and she didn't brush it off. She said 2 words. You're different. Not a question, a statement. Dan nodded. He said nothing more. They walked back. On the way back, Irma spoke up on her own for the first time. Not about the case. She asked how he knew the laws. Dan replied that he'd read them at the magistrate's office. She asked when. He said the last time he was in town. She was silent for a moment. Then she said that Borg couldn't read. Dan didn't answer. The silence was heavy. He knew that someday this question would come up point blank. Borg was illiterate. Dan could read a little. Borg didn't know the laws. Dan quoted sections of the law. Borg couldn't even set a snare for a hare. Dan hunted moose. Any wife would notice the difference. Irma had noticed it a long time ago. But until today, she'd kept quiet. Now it had become harder to stay silent. Dan decided to tell her the truth. Not all of it, just part of it. He said that 3 years ago, when Borg went into the woods and came back a different man, something had happened to him. Something he doesn't fully understand himself, that he's changed, that his memory works differently now, that he sees things he didn't see before, and that he can't explain it any better than that. Irma listened. She walked beside him and listened. Then she said that 3 years ago, Borg came back from the woods and became worse. And a month ago, he woke up on the doorstep and got better, and that she didn't care why. Only one thing mattered to her, that the person who had gotten worse wouldn't come back. Dan said he wouldn't. She nodded. They walked on in silence. An hour later, she slipped on an icy tree root. Dan caught her by the elbow. She didn't pull her arm away. After 3 steps, he let go. They didn't look at each other, but the air between them grew a little warmer. On the 45th day, they returned to Kameni Ruchi. Solveig met them at the gate, a look of alarm on her face. She said one word, Graham. Dan asked, "What about Graham?" Solveig said that Graham had come by yesterday with 2 men. They walked around the village. They spoke with the neighbors. They asked who was selling hides to Borga, who was setting traps for him. They said that anyone who acted outside the buyer's authorization would be held accountable by the Baron. Dan nodded. Just as expected. He'd paid off the debt and wrested the Baron's main leverage from his grasp. Now they'd strike differently. Not through him. Through those close to him. Through Olaf. Through Bjorn. Through anyone who'd chosen to work with Dan instead of Graham. Dan looked at Solveig. She was standing by the gate, clasping her hands in front of her. Her slender fingers had turned white at the knuckles. She was afraid, but she'd come out to the gate. She'd been waiting for them. A month ago, she wouldn't have left the house even if a tree had fallen in the yard. Dan placed his hand on her shoulder. Just for a second. She didn't flinch. He withdrew his hand and walked over to Olaf. Olaf was sitting by the stove, not planing wood. His hands rested on his knees. Next to him on the table stood a mug of untouched herbal tea. Dan walked in and sat down across from him. Olaf looked at him and said that Graham had threatened him. He said that if Olaf didn't stop working with Borg, they'd take everything he had left. His wagon, his sleigh, his cabin. By right of a merchant who holds a baronial charter to trade in the district. Dan asked what Olaf planned to do. Olaf was silent. Then he said that he was an old man with only one leg and that he had nothing with which to fight. That life had taught him not to go up against those backed by the Baron. Dan nodded. He didn't try to persuade him. He didn't promise protection he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he asked one thing. He asked who else in the village was getting less from Graham than they were owed. Olaf looked at him and laughed. Briefly, dryly, he said everyone, the whole village. Graham cheats everyone out of their share. Everyone knows it, and everyone keeps quiet. Because Graham is the only one who buys. Without him, there's nowhere to sell the goods. Dan said that now there was somewhere. Olaf looked at him for a long time. He shook his head. He said that Borg had started something that smelled like trouble, but he also said he wouldn't take down the snares. Not yet. Dan went over to Bjorn. Bjorn was sitting on the doorstep, twisting a piece of wire in his hands. His fingers bent the metal like clay. He said that Graham had come to see him too. He said that if Bjorn didn't stop making traps for Borg, Graham would stop buying dried fish from his mother. And the fish was their family's only source of income. Dan asked how much Graham paid for the fish. Bjorn said 1 copper coin per bundle. Dan asked how many bundles a month. Bjorn said 12. 12 copper coins a month. The whole family. Mother, sister, Bjorn. For 12 copper coins. Dan did the math in his head. In town, a bundle of dried fish costs 4 copper coins. 12 bundles is 48 copper coins. Almost 5 silver coins. Graham pays 12. A 4-fold difference. Dan told Bjorn that he would buy fish from his mother for 3 copper coins a bundle. And sell it in town himself. Bjorn thought slowly. Then something new appeared on his face. Not hope. Anger. Quiet. Deep. The anger of a man who had just realized how much had been stolen from him over his entire life. He said he would make traps, as many as they'll allow. Dan returned home. Irma was sitting in the shed, tanning a hide. The method involving the brain was working. The hide was getting softer with each attempt. Irma had found her rhythm. She worked differently than Dan. Dan worked with precision. Irma worked with fury. She poured into every movement the strength she'd spent 3 years building up just to keep from breaking. Now that strength was put to use. Under her hands, the hides turned into soft suede, for which the furrier in town paid twice as much as for regular leather. Dan walked into the shed and sat down beside her. He said that Graham was putting pressure on Olaf and Bjorn. Irma didn't stop kneading. She asked what he'd been waiting for. Dan said he'd been waiting for exactly this. Irma looked up. She looked at him. He explained. Graham was putting pressure on them because he was afraid. He was losing the village. Before, everyone went to him because they had nowhere else to go. Now there was Dan. 1 person is a fluke. 2 is a trend. If Graham loses 3, he'll lose half. And if half the village trades through Dan, Graham becomes unnecessary. And he knows it. Irma asked what would happen next. Dan said that next, Graham would go to the Baron. And the Baron wouldn't send Cain. He'd send someone more serious. Irma stopped crumpling the hide. Her hands rested on her knees. She asked if he was afraid. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said he was afraid. But not of the Baron. He was afraid he wouldn't have time. That winter would end before he could build what he had in mind. Irma looked at him. Then she nodded. She went back to the hide. The conversation was over, but something of it remained. Dan had told her he was afraid. Borg would never have said that. Borg would have pounded his fist on the table and yelled that he'd tear everyone apart. And then he'd drink and cry. Dan told the truth. Quietly, without putting on a show. And Irma heard him. For the next 10 days, Dan worked 18 hours a day. In the morning, he checked the traps. In the afternoon, he skinned and processed the game. In the evening, he repaired tools and built new traps. Bjorn brought 15 traps a week. Dan set them farther and farther from the village. The line of traps stretched 2 hours' walk in every direction. 34 traps. Sable, marten, hare, fox, ermine. The pelts piled up in the shed. Irma tanned them one by one. Solveig began to help, not with the pelts, but with the ointments. She found roots in the forest that Dan didn't recognize. Local plants, not from his past life. She knew their properties, knew what to brew for a cold, what to apply to a wound, what to mix with fat to make an ointment for frostbite. This knowledge had always been within her. It's just that no one had ever asked. Dan brought her some sable bile. He asked if anything could be made from it. Solveig sniffed it. She touched a bit to her tongue with her fingertip. She said that if she mixed it with badger fat and added pine resin, it would make an ointment that heals burns. Dan asked how much such an ointment cost in town. Solveig didn't know. Dan did. He'd seen something similar at the alchemists in Steinholm, a small pot, 10 silver coins. Solveig could make the same thing from what lay scattered on the forest floor. He gave her 2 pots he'd brought back from town. She set to work, quietly, intently, with the look on her face that comes over someone who, for the first time in their life, is doing something of their own. On the 53rd day, Dan went to town for the 4th time. The sled was fuller than ever. Hides, meat, fish from Bjorn's mother, and 2 little pots of ointment. He sold the ointment to the alchemist across the street from the one where he'd seen something similar. 7 silver coins per pot. The alchemist tried the ointment on his wrist, rubbed it in. He looked at his skin, sniffed it, asked who had made it. Dan said his wife. The alchemist said that if his wife could make something like this regularly, he'd buy 10 jars a month. Dan said he'd think about it. He left. At the market, he bought Solveig a set of glass jars and a funnel. A glass one. Fragile. Beautiful. It cost a silver coin. When Solveig saw the funnel, she took it in both hands. She held it in front of her. She looked at it. The glass glistened in the light of the stove. Solveig smiled. For the first time. A small smile. A brief one, but a smile nonetheless. On the 58th day, Dan killed his first creature. He found it by its tracks. The tracks were unusual. Not a beast, not a human. 4 toes on each paw. Wide. The claws had dug into the frozen snow to a depth of 2 fingers. The creature weighed as much as a large wolf. But wolves don't leave tracks like that. And wolves don't smell like that. Near each print, the snow was slightly melted. The paws were hot, abnormally hot. Dan followed the trail for 3 hours. The tracks led from the deep forest to a stream. There, the creature had been drinking. On the bank, the snow was covered in something dark, not blood, saliva, thick, brown. It had burned through the snow down to the ground. Dan crouched down and looked at the prints by the water. The beast had stood there for a long time. It drank slowly. Its left hind leg dragged slightly, an old wound or a birth defect. He followed the trail further. The creature was heading south, toward the village, toward the sheep pen at the edge of Stone Creek. Dan quickened his pace. He found the spot where it had stopped, at the edge of the woods, 100 paces from the outermost farmstead. It stood there for a long time. The snow was trampled. It looked at the village. Then it turned around and went back into the forest. It didn't attack, just scouting. Dan returned home. He sat on the porch. He thought. Borg's borrowed memory knew little about the creatures from the deep forest. Borg was afraid of them. Everyone was afraid. 3 years ago, they started coming out, rarely at first, then more often. The royal hunters would come and go. Some never returned. The village locked its doors and prayed. Dan didn't pray. He went to Olaf. He asked what the old man knew about the creatures. Olaf told him. Scaly wolves, in packs of 3 or 5. Fast. Fire won't scare them off. They can be killed with iron, but their hide is tough. You have to strike them in the throat or the belly. Eyeless moose. Solitary, slow, but their blood burns. If it touches the skin, it burns right down to the bone. Shadows. The most terrifying of all. They're invisible in daylight. They come out at dusk. They hunt people. Not animals. People. Dan asked how much a scaled wolf carcass was worth. Olaf raised his eyebrows. He said that the hunters sell them for 10 silver pieces a head, but the pelt and entrails are worth more. The scales are used for amulets. The liver goes into alchemical concoctions. Mages buy the heart. A whole carcass, properly butchered, can be worth 50 silver pieces, or more. Dan nodded. 50 silver coins, for one creature. He returned to the tracks the next day. The creature had come back. Same route. From the deep forest to the stream, to drink. Then to the forest's edge, to scout. Then back. Every night. The same routine. Dan smiled. Habits. Even creatures from the deep forest have habits, and habits can be exploited. He spent 2 days preparing. He chose a spot on the trail between the stream and the forest edge. A narrow spot, between 2 large spruce trees. The beast wouldn't be able to get around it. He dug a pit, a deep one, as tall as a man. He studded the bottom with sharpened stakes made of frozen larch, hard as iron. He laid poles across the top, covered it with snow, smoothed it out, covered his tracks. Nearby, on a fir tree, he tied a crossbow, a real one of the ones Bjorn had built according to his blueprints. A thick bow mounted on a frame, a bowstring made of braided sinew, an arrow with a heavy iron tip, a trigger mechanism on a rope stretched across the trail. The beast brushes against the rope. The trigger mechanism releases the bowstring. The arrow strikes at chest level. The pit and the crossbow. 2 shots. If the first one doesn't kill it, the second one will stop it. If neither works, Dan has a third plan. He'll do it himself, with a knife, up in a tree, above the trail. It was a bad plan. But a third plan is always a bad one. On the 3rd night, he climbed a spruce tree and waited. The frost was bitter. Dan wrapped strips of fur around his arms and legs. He sat motionless. He breathed slowly. He waited. In Montana, he once sat in ambush for 36 hours. On a cliff. In December. He was waiting for a fugitive who had taken refuge in a hunting cabin below. He waited it out. It was colder here. But here he knew the animal would come. Because the beast traveled this trail every night. It came after midnight. He heard it before he saw it. The crunch of snow, heavy, rhythmic, and breathing, hoarse, hot. Steam swirled among the trees like fog. Then he saw it. A wolf. But not a wolf. The size of a calf. Its fur was covered with tiny scales that glistened in the moonlight like wet stone. Its eyes were yellow, bright. They glowed with their own light. That same brown saliva dripped from its mouth. It hissed on the snow. The creature walked confidently along the trail. It didn't look back. The mistress of the forest. There was no one to fear. It reached the pit. Its front paw stepped onto the camouflage. The poles held. Dan clenched his teeth. It was heavier than he'd calculated. The second paw. A crunch. The poles gave way. The creature plummeted downward. A roar. Low. Deep-throated. The ground shook. Dan heard the stakes pierce its body. But the roar didn't stop. The creature thrashed in the pit. Its claws scraped against the walls. Clumps of frozen earth flew upward. It was trying to escape. Dan saw its paw appear above the edge of the pit. Its claws tore through the snow. The creature was alive. The stakes had wounded it but not killed it. The crossbow's string snapped taut. The creature brushed against it with its paw. A click. The bolt struck. It hit the neck. The creature twitched. The roar grew quieter. It wheezed. It thrashed about for another minute. Then it went still. Dan sat on the fir tree and didn't move. He waited. 5 minutes. 10. Silence. He climbed down from the tree. He walked over to the pit. He looked down. The creature lay on the stakes. The arrow stuck out of its neck. Its eyes were lifeless. Something dark was oozing from its wounds. Not red. Black. Thick. Dan looked at it and thought that in his past life, the scariest thing he'd ever seen was a man with a shotgun in a dark hallway. This was scarier. But the principle was the same. Preparation. Patience. One chance. He spent the rest of the night dragging the carcass out of the pit. Heavy. About 3 times heavier than a regular wolf. The scales were hard. Hot to the touch even after death. He loaded the carcass onto a sled and dragged it toward the village. He dragged it all the way to the house by dawn. He dumped it in the yard. He sat down on the porch. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the cold and exhaustion. Irma came out. She saw the creature. She stopped. She turned pale. Then she looked at Dan. She looked at the hollows in his eyes from a sleepless night, at the mud and black blood on his clothes. She didn't say anything. She went back inside. A minute later, she brought out a mug of hot tea. She set it next to him on the step. She went back inside. Dan took the mug. His hands closed around the hot clay. He looked at the dead creature and thought that this was only the beginning. It took a whole day to butcher the scaly wolf. Dan worked in the yard in the freezing cold. His hands were in rabbit fur gloves. The knife wouldn't cut through the scales. He had to look for gaps between the scales. Each scale was embedded in the skin like a roof tile. He peeled them off one by one. He laid them on the spread-out hide. By noon, he had collected 300. Each was the size of a thumbnail. Dark blue. Hard. Warm. Even dead, they retained the beast's warmth. Irma stood nearby and watched for the first hour. In the second hour, she asked if she could help. Dan showed her how to remove the scales. She sat down across from him and began working. Silently. Intently. Her fingers, accustomed to hides, quickly found their rhythm. She removed the scales twice as fast than he did. Dan cut open the carcass. The internal organs were different, not like those of an ordinary beast. The liver was large, dark purple. It was still pulsing. 16 hours after death. Dan set it aside. The heart, the size of 2 fists, black, solid, heavy. He took it in his hands and felt a vibration, as if something inside was humming at a frequency inaudible to the human ear. He placed it next to the liver, the gallbladder, small, firm. Something inside shimmered green. Solveig stepped closer. She wasn't afraid. She looked at the bile with the same expression a herbalist might use when examining an unfamiliar plant. Not fear, curiosity. She held out her hand, and Dan handed her the gallbladder. She sniffed it. She wrinkled her nose. She asked if she could cut it open. Dan nodded. She cut it open with a knife. Carefully. Over a bowl, a thick stream of green liquid flowed out. It smelled of pine needles and iron. Solveig looked at Dan. She said they could make something stronger than a regular ointment out of it, stronger than anything she'd ever made before. Dan asked how long it would take. Solveig said 2 days. While Solveig worked with the bile, Dan set to work on the meat. The creature's meat was inedible, tough, bitter. It stank of sulfur, but the bones were different, dense, almost like stone. He set aside the ribs and vertebrae. They could be made into arrowheads. Not for hunting, for defense. The bone of a scaly wolf is stronger than iron. He'd tested it. He'd tried chopping a rib with an axe. The axe bounced off. Not even a scratch remained on the bone. On the 60th day, news of the creature spread throughout the village. By evening, half the village had gathered at the Tavish family's fence. People stood and looked at the scales spread out on the pelt, at the bones stacked against the wall, and at the pot of green bile.
Old man Olaf came and stood there silently for a long time.
Then he said that hunters go after such creatures in groups of 5, with enchanted weapons, and they don't always come back. Dan didn't say anything. He didn't want glory. He wanted the village to see one simple thing. The creature can be killed, not with a sword or magic, with a trap, with patience, with knowledge of the beast's habits. Things any peasant has if you teach him to look properly. A boy approached him. Not Torin, a neighbor's son. About 12 years old, skinny, big eyes. He asked how Borg had set the trap for the creature. Dan looked at him. The boy's name was Eric, the son of a widow who lived on the edge of the village. A bear had killed his father 2 years ago. Dan could have chosen not to answer. He could have brushed the question off. Instead, he crouched down and began to tell him about tracks, about the beast's habits, about how the beast follows a single route and how that could be used to his advantage, about the pit, about the crossbow, about waiting in a tree. The boy listened without blinking. Irma stood in the doorway and watched. Dan talked for 10 minutes. Then he stood up. He told the boy that if he wanted to learn, he should come back tomorrow morning. He'd show him how to set a simple snare. For a hare, not for a bear. You have to start with the basics. The boy nodded and ran off. Irma looked at Dan. He was waiting for her to speak. She said that now he'd become a teacher too. Her voice was dry. But there was something warm in her eyes. On the 62nd day, Dan took the scales and bile into town. Irma stayed home. She had 8 hides tanning. She worked every day now, from morning till night. The hides came out of her hands soft and smooth, better than those of half the city's tanners. She knew it, and that knowledge was changing her. Not on the outside, on the inside. She began to walk differently, more upright. She held her head higher. For 3 years, she had been the wife of a drunkard and the mother of hungry children. Now she was a master. Not yet recognized, but a master nonetheless. In town, Dan didn't go to the furrier. He went to the magician. More precisely, to the man whom people in Steinholm called a mage. An old man in a shop on a back street, a rune master. His name was Holger. He bought alchemical ingredients and used them to make amulets and enchanted blades. For the hunters. For the Baron's guard, for those who could pay. Dan laid out the scales in front of him. Holger picked up one scale. He turned it over in his hand, placed it in his palm, closed his eyes, opened them, looked at Dan, asked where he'd gotten it. Dan told him. Holger listened without interrupting. Then he said that every scale from a scaly wolf contains a residual thermal charge. That 20 such scales could be used to make a frost amulet that would work all winter long. That the hunters pay 15 silver pieces for such an amulet. Dan had 300 scales. Holger offered 200 silver pieces for the entire batch. Dan didn't agree. He made a different offer. He would sell half the scales to Holger for 100 silver pieces. Holger would turn the other half into amulets, and they would split the profit. Holger looked at him. He smirked. He said that for a country bumpkin, Dan haggled like a merchant from the capital. They struck a deal. 100 silver coins for the batch, plus 10 amulets made from the remaining scales. 5 for Holger, 5 for Dan. Dan left Holger's place with a purse that was pulling at his belt. 100 silver coins. For a single creature. On the way back, he thought, the debt is paid off. He has money. The hides are coming in fast. Solveig's ointments are selling. The scales are worth their weight in gold. Everything's fine. Too fine. The marshal in him knew that when everything's going well, it means you don't see the problem. It's there. You're just not looking at it. He returned to Stone Creek at sunset on the 63rd day. Solveig was waiting for him at the gate. Her face was pale. Her hands were clenched. She said that while he was away, 3 people had come to the house. Not Graham, not Kane. Strangers. On horseback, wearing leather jackets with patches. Hunters. Royal hunters. They asked who had killed the beast, how, where. They searched the yard, looked at the tools, at the traps, at the bones in the shed. One of them picked up a bone and examined it for a long time. Then they rode off. They said they'd be back. Dan stood at the gate and watched the road they'd taken. The hoof prints in the snow led south, toward Steinholm, toward the Baron.
He thought that the problem he hadn't seen had just knocked on his door. The hunters. They want to know who he is. And what they find out, they'll either like or they won't. And Dan didn't yet know which option was worse. Back at the house, Irma had set dinner on the table. Porridge with meat, fish, Solveig's broth. The children ate quietly. Torrin sat next to Dan. For the first time. Not across from him. Right next to him. The boy didn't speak. He just sat closer. Dan ate and felt the warmth of the child's shoulder next to his own. And he thought that this was what he was fighting for. Not for silver, not for furs, so that this boy could sit next to him without being afraid. The hunters returned 5 days later. 3 of them. The same ones. The eldest introduced himself as Raynar. Tall, thin, a scar across his left eyebrow. Calm, attentive eyes. People who are used to gauging the distance to a threat have eyes like that. Dan recognized him as a professional. Not a bureaucrat, not a soldier, a hunter. Raynar dismounted at the gate and asked permission to enter. He didn't just walk in like Cain. He asked. Dan let him in alone. The other 2 stayed behind the fence. Raynar surveyed the yard, traps on the wall, the bones of a scaly wolf by the shed, hides on frames, a woodpile, a repaired fence. He stopped at the crossbow that Dan had taken apart and was drawing piece by piece. He touched the bowstring. He looked at the frame. He turned to Dan and said he'd never seen a design like that before. Dan replied that he'd come up with it himself. Raynar nodded. Then he asked point blank, how had Borg Tavish, a village debtor and former drunkard, killed a scaly wolf all by himself without an enchanted weapon? Dan told him. About the tracks. About the beast's route. About the pit and the crossbow. About waiting in the tree. Raynar listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change. When Dan finished, Raynar was silent for a moment. Then he said that his squad had lost 2 men to the same beast 3 months ago. 5 hunters with enchanted swords. 2 died. 1 was burned by the beast's saliva. It ripped open the other's stomach. They'd killed the creature, but the cost had been too high. And here, a single man with a rope and a shovel had done the same thing without a scratch. Raynar asked what Dan wanted. Dan replied that he wanted a hunting permit for his own section of the forest. His own, not through the Baron. Raynar shook his head. He said the permit was issued by the governor's office. It's expensive. It takes a long time, and the Baron would be against it. Dan said he knew. Raynar looked at him intently. He was silent for a moment. Then he said that the hunters needed people in the north, people who knew the forest and knew how to work with the beasts. He said he could recommend Borg Tavish to the office as a free tracker attached to the hunter's corps. It wasn't a permit, but it was a status that removed a person from the Baron's jurisdiction regarding hunting matters. Dan understood immediately. A free tracker, not a peasant, not a debtor, not a subject of the Baron in matters of trade, a man in the service of the crown. Formally, on paper. In reality, he continues to live in Stone Creek and do what he's always done. But the Baron can no longer touch him. Dan asked what the price was. Raynar said the price was simple. When the hunters need help in the north, they'll come to him. And he won't refuse. Dan agreed. Raynar held out his hand. Dan shook it. The handshake was firm. Raynar left. The next day, Dan told Irma. She listened while sitting on a bench in the barn, her hands greasy from the hide she'd been working on. When he finished, she asked one thing. She asked if they would take him away. If he would leave with the hunters when they called. Dan looked at her. He said he wouldn't leave. That the hunters come and go, but he would stay. She turned away toward the hide. She continued to knead it. But Dan saw how her shoulders, just a little bit, imperceptible to anyone else. He noticed. A week later, a sealed document arrived. Borg Tavish, freelance tracker with the Northern Corps of the Royal Hunters. Dan hung the document on the wall in his house, next to the certificate of debt settlement. 2 documents, 2 shields. Now he could trade without a dealer's license, hunt anywhere in the northern forest, and Ron Holt couldn't stop him. Graham found out 2 days later. He came to the fence. He stood there and looked into the yard. He didn't come in. Dan stepped out onto the porch. Graham said he'd heard the news, and that Borg had obviously found himself some patrons. Dan replied that they weren't patrons, employers. Graham spat into the snow and walked away. The next morning, 3 men came to see Dan. Not neighbors, people from distant yards. Each brought their own goods, hides, meat, and dried fish. They asked if Borg would take them to sell in town. Dan took them. He named a price twice as high as Graham's. The men left in silence. But they left faster than they had come. On the 70th day, Martha Bren arrived in Stone Creek. On foot. Holding a boy of about 6 by the hand, a bundle on her back, a bow slung over her shoulder. She stood at the Tavish gate and said nothing. Irma came out first. She looked at the woman, at the child, at the bow. Irma knew how to spot women who had reached the end of their rope. She herself had stood on that edge for 3 years. Martha said she was the widow of the hunter Torbjorn Bren, that her husband had died 2 years ago in the deep forest, that the pension from the Corps had lasted a year, that this year had come to an end, that she had nothing to feed her son, that she knew how to shoot and how to navigate the woods, and that she'd heard there was a man living in Stone Creek who needed hunters. Irma turned to Dan. He was standing in the doorway. He was looking at Martha. He was looking at the boy. The boy was holding onto his mother's hand and looked at Dan with round, serious eyes. He wasn't afraid. He was just looking. The way children look who are used to judging adults at first glance. Dan asked Martha how far she could shoot. Martha replied that she could hit a running hare at 100 paces. Dan asked if she'd tried setting snares and traps. Martha said no, but she was a quick learner. Dan nodded. He said there would be a spot for the boy on the bunks next to Torin, that Irma would show her where to get the blankets, that in the morning they would go into the woods together and he would watch her shoot. Martha stood there, motionless. She hadn't expected it to be so easy. She'd been prepared to persuade them, to argue her case, to beg, but they'd simply told her to come in. Irma walked past and called over her shoulder that dinner would be in an hour. Martha stepped into the yard. The boy's name was Sven, 6 years old, quiet, sturdy. He went into the house, and 10 minutes later he was sitting next to Torin on the floorboards. Torin was showing him a wooden wolf that Dan had carved, in silence. Both of them silent, but side by side. In the morning, Dan and Martha went into the woods. She shot. He watched. The first arrow hit the mark on the birch tree, 80 paces away. The second, 100. The third, 120. All 3 hit a circle the size of a palm. Dan thought that Rayner and his hunters didn't shoot like that. He said she did well. Martha nodded. Her expression didn't change. She wasn't pleased by the praise. She accepted the assessment, just as a tool accepts a test. I'm working, confirm. Dan showed her 3 types of snares. She memorized them on the first try. Her hands moved with precision. Her fingers were slender but strong. By evening, she had set 6 snares, all correct. Dan assigned her the northern section of the line. 10 snares. Check once every 2 days. Martha took the section in silence. No thanks, no questions. Work. The first results came in 3 days later. 2 sables, a hare, a marten. The pelts were skinned cleanly. Dan checked them. He nodded. Martha had become part of the machine. Over the next 10 days, Dan expanded the operation. 12 people worked for him. Olaf with the snares, Bjorn with the traps, Martha on the hunt. Bjorn's mother with the fish. 3 newcomers from distant farms with pelts and meat, Irma tanning the hides. Solveig was making ointments. 2 others helped with smoking and salting. Dan gathered the goods and took them to town. Every 10 days. The furrier in Steinholm became his regular customer. The alchemist bought Solveig's ointments without haggling. The runic master Holger waited for the creature's scales and bones. On the 80th day, Dan built a smokehouse. In the yard, out of stones from the stream and clay, Bjorn helped with the heavy work. Marta hauled the stones. Even Olaf came by, sat on a stump, and offered advice. The smokehouse was up and running 2 days later. The first batch of meat turned out perfect. Dan smoked it using the method he'd learned on the farm in Billings. Slow, cold smoke. Alder wood chips, 12 hours. The meat came out dark and dense. It kept for months without salt. In town, smoked venison fetched twice as much as fresh. Irma tasted it and froze. Then she looked at Dan and said that if they could make meat like that, all of Steinholm would be theirs. It was the first time she'd said we. Not he. Not you. Us. Dan said nothing, but he remembered. That same evening, Solveig came up to him. She was standing in the doorway of the workshop, a corner of the barn now set up with a shelf, jars, a funnel, and pots. She said she needed more bile. Not animal bile, the bile of creatures. Ordinary bile yields enough ointment for 5 copper coins. The bile of a scaly wolf yields enough ointment for 10 silver coins. 100-fold difference. Dan nodded. He knew. To get that, he'd have to kill another creature, or several. On the 85th day, he found new tracks. Not a scaly wolf, something else. Larger, heavier, 4 toes, but wider, deeper. The creature weighed as much as 2 wolves. The tracks didn't follow the trail. They went through virgin forest. The beast was tearing through the underbrush. It was heading straight ahead, not hunting, it was going somewhere. Dan traced the route on a mental map. The beast had come from the deep forest, crossed the stream, past a wild boar's lair, and continued eastward, toward the pass through the Wolf Mountains. It wasn't heading for the village, it was passing by, but passing by was too close. Dan looked at the tracks. Inside each footprint, the snow was unfrozen, cold. This creature didn't warm the ground like a scaly wolf. It froze it. He followed Martha. Together, they traced the trail. Martha walked quietly, bow in hand, arrow nocked. They found the spot where the creature had stopped, in a clearing. The snow within a 10-step radius was covered with frost, thick, white, and crunchy. In the center of the clearing stood a tree, dead, frozen solid through and through. The bark had cracked from the cold. The tree had died in a single night. The creature had stood here and waited. Dan didn't know what it was waiting for, but he found something else. A second set of tracks. Smaller, lighter, like a fox's but with 5 toes. The smaller creature had come to the larger one. They stood side by side. Then both left, in the same direction, toward the east. Dan looked at Martha. Martha looked at him. She said that 2 creatures together was a bad sign. Dan nodded. They turned back. But on the way back, something happened that changed everything. They were walking along the trail by the stream when a third creature emerged from the spruce grove. Small, about the size of a dog, gray, eyeless. Where its eyes should have been was smooth skin. The creature stood on the trail and sniffed the air. Martha raised her bow. Dan placed his hand on her wrist. He stopped her. The creature was sniffing at him. Not at Martha, at him. It took a step forward, then another. Dan didn't move. The creature came within 5 steps. Its snout stretched out, its nostrils flared. Then it froze. 1 second, 2, 3. And it turned around. It walked back into the spruce forest. It didn't run. It wasn't afraid, it just walked away, as if it had recognized him. Martha slowly lowered her bow. She asked what it had been. Dan didn't answer, because he didn't know. But deep in his memory, not his own but Borg's, something stirred. Something dark, cold, old. The thing Borg had brought back from the forest 3 years ago. The thing that had caused him to start drinking and screaming in his sleep. The mark. On the 90th day, Baron Holt came in person. Not on horseback, in a sleigh. With 4 guards, with Cain, with Graham. The procession stopped at the Tavish gates. The Baron didn't get out of the sleigh. He sent Cain. Cain entered the courtyard and said that Baron Ansel Holt wished to speak with Borg Tavish. Dan stepped out onto the porch. He looked at the sleigh. He looked at the guards. He looked at Cain. He said the Baron should come in. It's warm in here and there's hot broth. Cain relayed the message. The Baron stepped out of the sleigh. Dan saw him for the first time. Not very tall, stocky, broad-faced, intelligent, gray eyes, tired. Not malicious, just tired. A beard streaked with gray, a good fur coat, but not a new one. A man who had long since stopped spending on appearances and spent his money on business. Dan recognized the type. Not a villain, an administrator, a pragmatist. People like that don't kill for pleasure. They kill for the sake of order, and they sincerely believe that their order is the only one possible. The Baron entered the house. He sat down at the table. Solveig placed a mug of hot broth in front of him. The Baron looked at her, at the clean hut, at the children on the bunks, at the shelves with jars of ointments, at the animal hides on the wall, at the hunter's charter, at the document settling the debt. He picked up the mug and took a sip. Then he looked at Dan and said they'd talk. Dan sat down across from him. The Baron spoke at length, calmly, without threats. He said that the North isn't a city. That order here is maintained because everyone knows their place. That the barons collect taxes because those taxes pay for the roads, the guards, and the courts. That the merchants buy cheaply because they take on the risk of transportation and storage. That the system isn't perfect, but it works. It's been working for 30 years. And now one man comes along and breaks it. Not with a sword, worse. By example. If one peasant can trade directly, then everyone will want to. If everyone wants to, the middlemen will go bankrupt. If the middlemen go bankrupt, taxes will stop being collected. If taxes stop being collected, there will be no guards. If there are no guards, the North will be devoured by beasts. Dan listened. He didn't interrupt. When the Baron finished, Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said he understood. That the Baron was right about one thing. The system had worked, but it had stopped working. For 3 years, beasts have been coming out of the forest. Hunters are dying. Villages are emptying out. People are fleeing south. Tax revenue has been falling every year. Not because the peasants don't want to pay, because the peasants are destitute, because the middlemen take 4/5 of their profits, because a man who earns a copper coin's worth while doing work worth a silver coin cannot support his family and pay taxes at the same time. The Baron listened. His expression didn't change. Dan continued. He said he didn't want to break the system. He wanted to propose a different one. The village trades through him. He takes 1/10 of the profit. Not 4/5 like Graham. 1/10. The rest goes to the people. The people are getting richer. They pay their taxes. In full. Without delay. The Baron receives just as much or more. And he gets a village that can support and defend itself. One that doesn't flee south at the first sign of trouble, but stands its ground and fights. The Baron set his mug on the table. He looked at Dan. Then he asked what was stopping him from simply sending the guards to shut the whole thing down. Dan nodded. He said nothing was stopping him, except for one thing. He pulled a bundle from his belt, unwrapped it. Papers. 3 sheets. The first, a certificate of a free tracker affiliated with the Hunters Corps, meaning that Borg Tavish is under the protection of the Crown. The second, a copy of Article 41 of the Baron's Charter, regarding a free tracker's right to hunt freely and trade in the products of his hunts. The third, a letter from Raynar, senior hunter of the Northern Corps, to the governor's office. It recommended issuing Borg Tavish a hunting license for the Stone Ravine district. It noted that this tracker had single-handedly hunted a scaly wolf using a method previously unknown to the Corps, and that his expertise is of strategic interest to the Crown. The Baron read, slowly. His expression changed with every line. Dan watched and saw the calculations at work behind those gray eyes. The Baron was accustomed to peasants thinking like peasants, but sitting before him was a man who thought like an investigator who had put 11 such barons behind bars in a past life. The Baron placed the papers on the table. He was silent for a minute. Then he said, 2 options. Dan nodded. He said, 2. First, the Baron accepts the terms. Dan negotiates on behalf of the village. The Baron receives his tax. Everyone survives. Option 2. The Baron refuses. Dan files a complaint with the governor's office. The tax collectors will confirm it. The governor will send an audit. The audit will find that Graham has been paying the peasants a quarter of the price for 30 years, and that the Baron knew about it. It's not a crime under the law, but it's a scandal. And a scandal in the North, where everything is already falling apart at the seams, is the last thing a baron who wants to keep his position needs. The baron stood up. He put on his hat. He looked down at Dan. He said that Borg Tavish wasn't the man he claimed to be. Dan replied that he was exactly who he claimed to be, a man who wants his family to be fed and safe. The baron walked out. He got into his sleigh. He drove away. Graham stood by the gate and watched. Dan looked at him. Graham looked away first. Irma was standing behind the door. She had heard everything. Dan turned toward her. She walked over. Close. Closer than she'd ever been in all these months. She raised her hand and adjusted the collar of his coat. Her fingers lingered on the fabric for a second longer than necessary. Then she stepped back and walked over to the stove. Dan stood there, feeling the warmth from her fingers on his neck. It lingered until evening. The Baron's reply did not come in words. It came at night. On the 100th day, 5 mercenaries. Dan knew they would come. He didn't know when, but he knew they would come. Because Baron Holt was a pragmatist, and pragmatists who cannot win with paper win with fire. Dan had been preparing ever since the day he returned from the Baron's office. He didn't tell anyone. Almost no one. He told Martha. Because Martha understood war. She listened in silence. She nodded. She asked when. Dan said he didn't know. Maybe in a week. Maybe in a month. Martha said she'd be ready. He told Irma. Not everything. Just part of it. He said the Baron might send people. That they needed to be ready. Irma didn't turn pale. She wasn't scared. She asked what to do. Dan explained. She nodded and went into the shed. An hour later, she came out with a crossbow she'd assembled herself from spare parts. It was crooked, but it worked. Dan looked at the crossbow. He looked at her. She replied that she'd slept with an axe for 3 years and that the crossbow was more convenient. Dan spent 4 evenings preparing the yard. He dug the pit back in October, right after Kane's first visit. Back then, it looked like a cellar, a long trench by the gate, covered with boards and snow. 2 weeks ago, he had deepened it and sharpened the stakes at the bottom. Now there was a single safe path leading from the gate to the porch, narrow, along the left wall. Everything else was a trap. Near the woodpile, he had dug in 2 posts and stretched a rope between them at knee height. You can't see it in the dark. You'd trip and fall face first into the snow. And in the snow were stakes. Not deadly, but they'd stop you. On the roof of the shed lay a sack of ash. A rope hung down from it. Pull it and ash would pour down on your head. It would blind you. It would clog your eyes and mouth. The rune master Holger had made something for him at his request. 2 rune nets, rope nets the size of a blanket, with runes on the knots. You throw them at a person, and the runes activate from the body's heat. The net tightens. It doesn't kill. It holds you. You can break free in a minute if you know how. If you don't, then in 5. 5 minutes is an eternity in battle. Dan placed the nets by the porch and by the shed. He gave Marta a position in the woodpile. A bow, 12 arrows. Its range covers the entire yard. Irma is in the attic. A crossbow. 1 shot. But what a shot. He gave Solveig a different task. She made 6 vials, small ones, glass ones, a mixture inside. The bile of a scaly wolf. Coniferous resin. Mutton fat. Upon impact, the vial shatters. The mixture flares up. Not fire. Acrid smoke. Tears. Coughing. Impossible to breathe for a minute. Solveig lined up the vials on a shelf by the cellar. Her hands didn't tremble. On the last evening before what happened, Dan was sitting on the porch. It was quiet. The snow was falling thick and steady. A blizzard was approaching from the north. Dan knew they would come during the blizzard, because a blizzard covers tracks, because a scream can't be heard in a blizzard, because that's what people do when they don't want to leave any traces. Irma came out to him. She sat down next to him, without asking, without speaking. She just sat down, shoulder to shoulder. Dan could feel the warmth of her body through his coat. She said the children were asleep, that Martha was in her place, that Solveig was ready. Dan nodded. She was silent for a moment. Then she said that if they survived, she wanted him to know one thing, that she no longer expected him to snap, that she hadn't expected it for a long time, and that she carried that comb in her pocket every day. Dan turned his head and looked at her. Snowflakes were melting on her eyelashes. He said nothing. She wasn't expecting anything. They sat side by side for another minute. Then she got up and went to the attic. Dan stayed on the porch, alone, unarmed, in his sheepskin coat. They arrived after midnight. The blizzard howled. The snow was blowing horizontally. Visibility was 10 steps. 5 of them. Dark figures at the gate. Dan saw them. They didn't see him. He stood motionless on the porch, a white sheepskin coat against the white snow. The first mercenary entered the gate. He took a step forward, a second step, a third. The planks beneath him creaked. He sank in up to his waist. He screamed. The second one rushed toward him. He tripped over a rope by the woodpile. He fell. The stakes pierced his palms. The third one stopped. He began to look around. A sack of ash crashed down on his head. He choked. He clutched his face. The net fell from above. The runes flashed with a dim blue light. The net tightened. The fourth ran toward the shed. Solveig threw the flask from behind the cellar door. The glass shattered at his feet. Smoke billowed upward. The mercenary doubled over. He coughed. He cried. He couldn't raise his weapon. The fifth one, the smartest one, spun toward the gate and ran. Martha's arrow pierced his thigh. He fell into the snow. Half a minute later, a second net covered him. 4 minutes. Dan didn't move from the porch. He didn't touch a single one of them. By dawn, 5 bound men lay in the yard. The snow around them was untouched. The blizzard was subsiding. Irma came down from the attic. The crossbow was slung over her shoulder. She hadn't fired it. She hadn't had to. She looked out at the yard, at the bound men, at Dan. He was standing by the porch, breathing heavily, not from exertion, but because it was all over. She went into the house. 2 minutes later, she came out with a mug of hot, spiked mead. She placed it in his hands. He held it with both palms, warming his fingers. Solveig came out of the cellar. Martha came out from the woodpile. Everyone stood in the yard in silence. Dan took a sip of the spritzer. He looked at his women, at the house, at the bound mercenaries in the snow. He said one sentence. He said that now they were a clan. Irma sat down next to him on the step. She leaned her shoulder against his. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in over 3 years in this house, she fell asleep next to a man, not out of exhaustion, but out of peace. The mercenaries were handed over to Raynar. The hunter arrived 2 days later in response to a letter Dan had sent via the boy Eric. Raynar interrogated the 5 of them. All 5 named Cain. Cain named Graham. Under pressure, Graham named the Baron. The chain was complete. Raynar drew up a report and sent it to the governor's office. Not because he loved justice, because an attack on a freelance tracker affiliated with the Hunters Corps is an attack on the Crown, and the Crown does not forgive. Baron Holt received a letter from the governor 3 weeks later. Dan didn't know what it said, but he knew the outcome. Graham was removed from Stone Creek. The shop was shut down. Cain was dismissed from his post. The Baron remained. But the letter from the governor hung over him like an axe. One wrong move, and the axe would fall. The Baron chose silence. On the 120th day, Dan received his hunting charter, a real one, for the stone log tract from the stream to the Wolf Mountains. Raynar delivered it personally, with the Chancellery's seal and the governor's signature. Dan hung the charter on the wall next to 2 other documents. 3 sheets of paper, 3 victories, a debt paid off, the status of a tracker, his own land. Irma stood nearby looking at the wall. Then she turned to him and said the wall was small. Soon there wouldn't be enough room. Dan smirked. For the first time in her presence. She caught that smirk and snorted into her fist. Quietly, briefly, but she snorted. Spring arrived on the 130th day. The snow began to settle. The stream murmured beneath the ice. The sun began to linger over the spruce grove for an hour longer. Stone Creek was changing. Not just the Tavish house, the whole village. Olaf was repairing his sled and whistling. Bjorn was building a shed for his workshop. Bjorn's mother was drying fish on new racks that her son had whittled from good wood. 3 families from the outlying yards rebuilt their fences. 1 family whitewashed their house. Little things, but little things that speak volumes. People who believe in tomorrow repair their fences. People who don't believe drink. On the 140th day, Dan announced the creation of a trade association. Not a clan. Not yet. An association. 23 households from Stone Creek, plus 2 from the neighboring village. A shared brand. A shared trip to town once every 10 days.
a shared fund for travel expenses. 1/10 of the profits goes into a common fund. The fund is used to maintain the road, cover repairs, and provide assistance to those who have fallen ill or lost their breadwinner. Dan wrote the bylaws, 3 pages, in plain language. He explained each point at the town meeting by the well. People listened. Some didn't believe him. Some were afraid. But when Dan cited the figures, when he said how much each of them lost to Graham in a year, and when he showed the difference between what the middleman paid and what the city pays, the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of calculation. 20 out of 23 households signed on. 3 couldn't make up their minds. Dan didn't pressure them. He said the door was always open. On the 150th day, Irma butchered her first creature. Dan brought a carcass of a small, eyeless beast from the forest. Not dangerous, a loner. It had been caught in a reinforced trap. Irma stood over the carcass with a knife. Her hands didn't tremble. She cut the hide along the line Dan had shown her. She peeled off the scales. She cut it open. She removed the entrails. She laid them out. The bile separately. The heart separately. The liver separately. She worked in silence, intently, with the expression a master has when performing a difficult but familiar task. Dan stood nearby and didn't interfere. He didn't need to. She handled it. When she finished, she straightened up. She looked at her hands covered in black blood. She looked at Dan. He nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. On the 160th day, 2 things happened. First, Solveig spoke to Torin in front of everyone at dinner. Not just a word, a whole sentence. She said that tomorrow she'd show him which herbs to gather along the stream bank. Torin looked at her and nodded, as if she'd been talking to him every day, as if the 1.5 years of silence had never happened. Children know how to accept miracles without question. The second thing. That evening, a young woman knocked on the Tavish family's door. She was young and tall, with short-cropped red hair. A man's knife hung from her belt, and she carried a bag over her shoulder. She smelled of smoke and the road. She said her name was Helen Morrow, that she was the daughter of a merchant from Steinholm, that her father wanted to marry her off to an old merchant, that she had run away, that she had nowhere else to go, that she'd heard about Stone Creek and about a man who traded honestly, and that she knew how to count. Irma looked at Dan. Dan looked at Helen. The girl stood in the doorway, her back straight, chin up, eyes dry. She wasn't asking for pity. She was offering herself as a tool. Dan asked what 17 times 23 would be. Helen didn't blink. She said 391. Dan asked what it would be if they subtracted 1/10. Helen said 39 and 1/10. Dan nodded and told Irma they needed 1 more bowl on the table. Helen sat down. Irma set the bowl down. Porridge with meat. Helen ate slowly. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from relief. A week later, Helen took over the entire business side of things. The income and expense ledger, pricing, trip planning, and negotiations with buyers in town. She could calculate in her head faster than a clerk could on paper. She haggled with a smile that fooled anyone who thought a pretty girl couldn't do math. After 2 weeks, profits had risen by 1/3. Not because there was more merchandise, because Helen had found customers Dan hadn't sought out. Furriers in 2 other towns, inns along the southern highway, an apothecary who bought Solveig ointments in bulk. One evening, Helen sat at the table writing in a book. Dan sat across from her mending a boot. Not his own, Sven's. Martha's son's. The boy was growing fast, and the boot had become too small. Dan was unpicking the seam and inserting a strip of leather to give it 2 months' worth of extra room. Helen looked up and watched his hands. Then she said that her father hadn't repaired a single thing in the house in 30 years. Dan replied that her father had been too busy counting other people's money. Helen snorted into her mug. Then she said she liked it here. Dan replied that he did too. It was true. He was sitting in a house that had been empty and cold just 4 months ago. Now the stove was burning. There was food on the table. 5 children were sleeping on the bunks. Hides were drying in the barn. In Solveig's workshop stood jars of ointments. 3 certificates hung on the wall. Behind the door, Martha was sleeping with a bow at her headboard. In the attic, Irma was combing her hair with that very comb. He could hear it, the quiet rustling of the teeth against her hair. Rhythmic, calm, the sound of home.
On the 200th day, Dan stood on the porch and looked out at the yard. Morning. Sun. The first day the snow really started to melt. Drops falling from the roof. In the yard, Torin and Sven were practicing tying loops. Eric, the neighbor's boy, was helping. 3 boys crouched in the snow. Serious, focused, their fingers wet. The loops were crooked, but they were learning.
Martha was peeling onions by the woodpile.
Solveig went down to the stream with a basket to gather herbs. She went every morning now, all by herself, without fear. Helen sat on the porch next to Dan, smoking her pipe. She was counting something in her head. Her lips were moving. Then she said that if the flow held up, by fall they'd be able to open a shop in Steinholm. Their own. Not through the furrier, directly. Dan nodded. Fall was a long way off, but he could already see it. He could see the shop. He could see the sign. Tavish. The Tavish clan. Irma came out of the house. She was carrying 2 buckets to the well. Dan stood up. He took the buckets from her. She didn't argue, didn't pull them away. She handed them over. She looked at him. He walked toward the well. She stood on the porch and watched his back. Helen glanced at her, then at Dan, then back at Irma. She smiled and said nothing. Dan drew some water. He carried it back. He set the buckets down on the porch. Irma took them and went into the house. She turned around at the threshold. She said there would be pie that evening, with lingonberries, the first in 4 years. Dan stood on the porch and looked out at his yard, at the children learning to set hinges, at the women who no longer glanced back at the door, at the smoke from the chimney rising rose in a straight white column into the blue spring sky. Somewhere deep in the forest, the door awaited. Somewhere in Borg's foreign memory lay a secret. Ahead lay the trading houses of the capital, the monsters of the Second Circle, and the expedition into the heart of the thicket. Ahead lay the war for the North, which was only just beginning. But that was in the morning. Right now, the air smelled of smoke, pine needles, and fresh leather. Raindrops were tapping against the railing. There would be lingonberry pie tonight, and Dan Crow stood on the porch of a stranger's house, which had become his home. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't thinking about what tomorrow would bring, because today was enough.